Hello and welcome to the Organic Gardening Podcast. I'm Fiona Taylor, and later on I'll be joined by my colleagues Chris Collins and Dr. Anton Rosenfeld. I don't know about you, but for me it's been a very tricky spring so far. I've needed to apply liquid barley straw to my pond to help achieve balance and stop the blanket weed taking over, and I've lost quite a few seedlings, so I'm relying on friends for chilli and tomato plants. But there have been a few joys too, such as the bird box that I put up last year becoming home to a pair of great tits in the past couple of weeks. It's a great reminder of how small a thing like a bird box can make a real difference, even in the centre of a city. And in this podcast, we'll be talking all about wildlife gardening, which is at the heart of the organic way of both farming and gardening. Chris Collins spoke to author and broadcaster Chris Baines, a true expert in ways we can all support nature. When it comes to your questions, this month we talk about the difficulties of sourcing organic topsoil, whether or not perennial vegetables need to be part of a garden rotation system, and organic methods for controlling scarred fly. But first, I'm off to put the world to rights with Chris in the potting shed. Hello, Chris. How are you?
I'm very well, Fiona. How are you?
Yeah, I'm okay. Thank you. It is gorgeous weather here, I have to say, today. Recording day here at Ryton. It's absolutely gorgeous. Sun beating down. How is it with you?
Yeah, it's pretty good. I mean, the spring's here, isn't it? I mean, I went out the allotment a couple of days ago and had a big session on there, and you could feel the sun on your neck, and the birds were tweeting, getting very amorious, I must say. So, yeah, it's just it's such an uplifting time of year, isn't it? I honestly say I'm in pretty much a good mood all the time at this time of year, and that's not a bad thing, is it?
Well, except, Chris, I have to inform you that I am bereft.
Oh, what's happened?
Oh, my word.
A horticultural disaster?
It's a horticultural disaster. It really is. This year, for the first time, I grew a few things under just a little tiny basic grow light kit.
Yeah.
And I grew a number of varieties of tomatoes that I'd saved the seed myself.
Yeah.
And some chilies that I'd saved the seed of, and some aubergines. The aubergines took about 3 weeks to germinate. I'd been sort of yearning over all of it. They were all doing really nicely. I had probably about 9 sort of square pots, each with, a smattering of really good, healthy little seedlings in. And over the Easter weekend, I thought I'll pop them out to the greenhouse. The greenhouse, we had a bit of a colder snap over the back end of the Easter weekend, and that was when I put them out there, but I made sure there was some heat going on. So I popped them in the heated propagator, popped the lid on the propagator, thinking that would sort of replicate the conditions in the house. And not 24 hours later, they were all dead.
How did they die?
They were white and they were keeled over, and that was that.
Sounds like they might have scorched. Oh, that's a shame. You can go again, though.
Well, this is what I wanted to ask you. So we're in May, and, obviously I want to, recover for lost time. So what can I do to compensate? Genuinely, what can I sow now?
Well, I would start them again from seed and propagators, definitely. They like a long season, the chilies and the aubergines, the tomatoes, but I think if you're clever with, a bit of foliar feed and stuff, you could kick them on. I think that what you just described there is why, when normally if you go to see a greenhouse, a productive greenhouse this time of year, you'll see they're white, because what they do is they put all this special paint all over the greenhouse to stop exactly what you've just described, because it's so easy to scorch, and it's like a big magnifying glass, isn't it? That's what's happened, and it's gone. But it's in a way, the silver lining is you probably learned that now, and that's how we learn in gardening, where you kind of these things happen and we get wise. And I think that I would sow again, particularly you'll be all right with tomatoes, you can sow tomatoes again. Aubergines, it's kind of on the edge because they like a long summer, but chilies and peppers, I would just go again, Fiona. I don't think you've got anything to lose, but start them in trays, sow them, put them in the propagator, and then prick them out as soon as they're up. Prick them out small into individual cells and go again.
Okay, and so regardless of my tomatoes, chilies and aubergines then, what can I start to sow in May, from scratch anyway?
Well, I'm coming into my third wave. I've got my front room.
So you're showing off now.
My front room is full of aubergines, tomatoes, and peppers just to rub it in. But I've been the big job at the moment is I've been lugging them all outside to sunbathe because it's hardening off time, isn't it? So I want to get them adapted. It's a bit windy today, and they all look a bit windblown, to be honest with you now. But they're all right. But they were my first wave of sowing, and then I kind of do a second wave of sowing in April, which is all my brassicas and that sort of stuff, some more root crops. So my third wave starts now, and that's runner beans, squash, pumpkin, courgette, those sort of exotic tender plants. that I like to start them very late because I won't try putting anything out till mid-May, late May, because you might get a radiation frost or a late cold wind. So I don't like to start those too early because what ends up happening is you get these, especially if you've grown them indoors in a home rather than greenhouse, you get these big leggy plants with very poor root systems. That's what tends to happen. So I think in the next sort of week, 10 days into May, I will then start doing all my runner beans, my courgettes, and they tend to come up really quick in a propagator. I'll put them all in root trainers because they don't like, especially the beans, they don't like root disturbance. So I put them in ribbed pots, and as soon as they're up, I'll wait for them. Well, I decide the weather's warm enough, and I'll pop them into the ground. Yeah, so third wave, I call it, out of the 3 waves.
Well, I'm going to ask you about flowers because, the tragedy continues because in that whole scenario, I also lost all my cosmos and my Cerinthy major, which is a particular favourite of mine.
I know it, yeah, it's nice. Yeah, so I'd sow those again. You're okay with those. They're very seasonal plants. I think Cerinthy is a hardy annual, isn't it? I think so. You might be able to. You'll go again with them. I've no problem with resowings. You can carry on right through the summer, really, but obviously the quicker you get them up and going, the longer season you have. So I'd try again. Yeah, on my allotment, I've got literally. I put in at the end of the month 54 drills of flowers of veg. So it all goes up, and I put them in spacing. So if I have any disasters, I can intersow as well. So I wouldn't be too downhearted about it, John.
And in terms of direct sowing outside, because I've got my sort of mixed flower and veg bed, which I've been careful over the winter because I don't mind the sort of friendly self-seeding weeds, shall we say. I'm a particular fan of plantain, for example, because you can use the seeds. And a lot of those sort of spring weeds are edible. And I quite enjoy that. It's lovely, actually. It doesn't look like weeds. It just looks like sort of, wildflowers. And it just means that the soil has remained covered. So I've been not in a hurry to clear it. But when I do start to clear it, I'd like to do some, direct sowing of flowers that are going to be up quickly. But I'm always scared to do it, Chris, because the years that I've done it in the past, I've done that kind of flower sowing at the beginning of May. I've got all excited, and then they'll get a late frost. So which ones do you need to still hold back on is probably more the question first, rather than what we do. What should we not do?
Well, there's 2 types of sort of what I'll call seasonal flowers that I grow. So half hardy annuals is, I love them on my balcony. They're a bit blousy. They're things like pelargoniums and lobelias and petunias. You need to start those in a propagator, a bit like exactly a tomato or aubergine or a runner bean. They need to be started in protective scenarios and then brought on and then planted out late May when all danger of frost has gone. A hardy annual, however, you can put in now. Well, I think I've got about 25 drills of short drills on the allotment, and that's things like sunflowers. I've got a massive variety of sunflower on there. I've got calendula, English marigolds. I've got cornflowers, godetias, and you'll get a big selection of them if you go to a garden centre. You'll see them in the seed thing, and they could go straight in the ground. And if you sow them in drills, you'll see them in nice lines when they come up. You'll know that they're your hardy annuals and not the weeds that will naturally come and colonise areas that have been dug over.
That sunflowers are hardy annuals.
Yeah, well, it's funny. I started some for the kids in the block. I went out and I did a little survey of the family saying, what would you want to plant outside the block here? And all the kids said sunflowers, which is quite a normal answer, really. And so I started some in here to give them as presents to plant out when we plant out. And you could just see they don't like being inside at all. They really object to it. So they like that coldish soil to kick them off, I think. They're a hardy annual. But it's amazing on the lot. I think I've got 8 types in, and some of them are only grow to like 0.5 metre tall and are bronze. And some of them are like yellow and will get up 2.5 metres. So I'm quite excited to see them. And they come up quite quick. They come up. I'll sow them quite thick, so I'll probably thin them out a bit. And the big thing is you need to support them. You need to get bamboo on them and make sure they're supported.
They're so strong, though, as well, aren't they? I mean, they get so fat, those stems.
Yeah, once they get going, it's this time at the moment. I'm a massive babysitting operation. It's a busy time. I just have to keep an eye on it all. But once the roots get down, and then they start to put on growth, you're away. It's the speed of it. I was looking at a picture of my allotment last year, before and after, and you're like, really? It's just quite an incredible miracle. It really is.
It really is. And I left the sunflowers in all winter, and they've just been covered in birds, and that just not a thing goes to waste. It's that wonderful sort of cycle, isn't it, of something going all the way through. Absolutely brilliant, and actually great attractor of wildlife. And I know later on we're hearing from your chat with Chris Baines all about wildlife gardening, and I wonder what sort of insights did you pick up from Chris Baines?
Well, he's an interesting character because he very much pioneered this sort of thing. Back in the days when I would have been starting gardening, and everybody was like, it has to be immaculate. It has to be, weed, attack it, pest, attack it. And we've come a long way since then. But it is all about, it's accommodating. We're, as Garden Organic do, we're into biodiversity. I want to see, it's not my garden, it's all nature's garden in a way. And that means I have to cope with certain pests as well, which could obviously provide me with problems. But the idea is you create a balanced area, isn't it? Hence, I put the hardy annuals in, flowers for my pollinators. I like to, as it grows in, I don't like to see too much open ground, so that protects the soil, provides cover for stuff. So I kind of think that he pioneered that, and he's a gardener though, like me. So it isn't, I'll just let it be. It's none of that. You know what I mean? We'll have it. He is gardening, but he's gardening with nature in mind, which is obviously, as we're seeing now, this is the way forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose we all have different species that visit our gardens or our allotments or our balconies, and it's quite interesting to think about the kind of approaches that you and we've had a few laughs about the pigeons and how you outwit the pigeon. One person's pest is another person's joy. It's really an interesting debate when you start to think it through. But I do think that actually, even though we think we're all a bit more enlightened, if you were to flick through the pages of 2 or 3 popular garden magazines, you would see an awful lot of adverts for ways to keep wildlife out of your garden. We seem to favour birds, and so let's feed the birds, but let's put a sort of siren in our garden that will deter the foxes. It doesn't quite stack up, does it?
No, it doesn't. And I think, you're right. If you went into a well-known DIY store or a lot of gardening, there'll be a wall of pesticide. The irony of it is actually, if you're prepared to be patient, you'll get a balance in the garden and nothing will be too dominant anyway. The perfect example is ladybirds, ladybug larva with your black fly on your runner beans, your broad beans. Nature kind of comes in and deals with it by itself anyway. We mentioned foxes. Well, I used to have a big pigeon problem on my allotment, and there's a few foxes there this year, and I've not seen a pigeon. So you kind of find it kind of gets its balance. And also, I just think that don't overthink it. Relax is the word I suppose I'm looking for. I have a problem with things like peel slugs on the allotment, which is subterranean. They kind of go under the ground and they kind of eat through stuff, and that causes me down. They eat, to give you an example, they eat strawberries, but I probably only lose 10% of the strawberries, 15%. So, in the bigger picture, I'd rather take the 85% and have a biodiverse allotment that hasn't got pesticide on it than just have 100% and everything's sprayed. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
I think there's an element of sacrifice here. Yeah? And also observation. We talk about this all the time. I'm out there with my tongs, and if I see them, I'll pick them over. The reward is you have the magic moment. I was sitting on my sofa on the balcony. I've got 2 bats that come every night at dusk. And there's just like pinky sort of sunset bats are flittering around outside the window. What more could you ask, really?
Oh, I absolutely love them. I really do. I have them as well, actually. I'm right in the middle of a town as well. And that is the extraordinary thing, actually, is I don't know much about zoology or animals in general, but I do understand that there is a sort of genetic memory that exists with all species. And so that's why things come back to places where they breed. As I say, right in the middle of Worcester is where I live. I came out of my front door and there was a muntjac running down the road.
Really?
Yeah, I think it was a muntjac. It was either a muntjac or just a very small deer.
Yeah.
I couldn't believe it. I said, what? But actually, it turns out that the area where I live 150, 200 years ago used to be a deer park. I don't know. I could be making it up, but it is interesting, isn't it? And
yeah, it is. I think that if you allow, this is the thing with nature, it's very strong. And if you allow it to expand and you allow it to thrive, then it will do that. We can fight it all we like, but it recolonizes quite quickly when it's allowed to do it. So I think being a wildlife lawyer, I think this is what Chris Baines' main message is he makes allowances for it. He likes to garden, but he'll have areas where he'll have a habitat pile or bits of his garden where he allows it. Ponds and what bog gardens you've got a pond are incredible areas for wildlife. So you're inviting it in to your garden, you're inviting it in, and it takes advantage of that. It comes pretty quickly. My allotment neighbour, Peter, Irish Peter, who's next to me on the allotments, he just put a pond in. It had tadpoles in it within a week. The good thing about that is tadpoles will eat keel slugs. So I'm all up for this sort of stuff, So,
but not when they're still tadpoles, I assume.
No, I think there'd have to be a mighty muscling tadpole. Yeah, the frogs will, hopefully. Yeah, the frogs will. But isn't it amazing? The pond's only been there a week, and they appear. These tadpoles appear, if by magic almost. We build it, they will come scenario in many ways. So if you're planting plants for pollinators and butterflies and bees, they will come. So if you're doing your gardening to allow nature to be involved, it will be involved. And that means at the same time, your pests, your unwanted wildlife will probably be balanced off and checked off as a result.
Amazing, isn't it? I mean, we moved, as you know, from a tiny little pond at the top of the garden, which we took out, created a big pond down the bottom of the garden, a fair distance if you're a newt, but it didn't seem to deter them. Actually, I'd be interested to know, did Chris talk a lot about water? I mean, what was the key thing that he said you want to encourage biodiversity? Was it water?
Very much put an emphasis on ponds. I think that they will talk about as well is any kind of bits, anything that's decaying. So you might get a hole in the side of a branch or anything like that, or, little bits of rock crevices he talks about a lot. Little areas that wildlife can get into and be secure in. But he tells one nice bit also about coming out, at night and putting his torch into the pond and how it's all alive. So you're kind of making those little habitats, those areas for nature to thrive. It really comes across strong when he's chatting away. Crevices and water and planting pollen-rich plants that haven't been overbred and bloused out. Pollen's been bloused out of them.
There's something very interesting about dead wood, isn't there? I'm told that the right thing to do, if you've got a shrub, a woody shrub, or maybe a small tree or something that has died, don't rush to take it out.
Well, now you see, it's interesting you're saying about how we used to garden, how we garden now. They'll leave a standing dead tree in a park, because they're absolutely wonderful for nature, from small, invisible almost nature, all the way up to bats and birds. They really are. Rot holes is another really big one. So if you've got a branch that's died and you get these rotten bits where it's died away, you get these rot holes when it breaks eventually. Well, they're little universes for wildlife. They really are.
Gosh, it's actually really inspiring, isn't it? And it's making me rethink, actually, how can I make sure my garden does everything it can. I mean, I think I've got a bit of an ambition, actually. I need to see a slow worm in my garden.
I found one on there, because I get them on the allot. I find them in the compost bin. I find them there, and they're just amazing creatures. They're just like the bat. They're kind of like a bonus creature, aren't they? There's something a bit special about them, because you just don't see them that commonly, So, yeah, definitely. A compost bin, anywhere that's dark and dank is what they like. I think if you create that sort of environment, they will come.
Oh, it's inspiring, though, isn't it? As always, you stop and think about these things, making me feel encouraged to go and have another go.
Don't be downhearted. Don't be downhearted, Fiona. Give it another go. I think to go again is a good expression for a gardener. We crack on, and you're right, it is uplifting. Particularly this time of year, because everything's just so beautiful and so fresh, and it's hard not to walk around without a big smile on your face, I think.
Now, a few weeks back, Chris Collins chatted to broadcaster and author Chris Baines ahead of the release of the new edition of his classic book, How to Make a Wildlife Garden, originally published in 1985. Chris has been a long-time supporter of Garden Organic, and today remains one of our key advisors. The two Chris's settled into a great discussion on the place for activism in gardening, as well as offering the very best tips and advice on how to welcome wildlife into your garden.
Welcome to the Garden Organic podcast, and thanks for joining us. I've got a treat today. I'm with Chris Baines, who used to be part of Garden Organic, played a big role, in fact. How are you doing, Chris?
Really good, really well. Just enjoying seeing the spring emerging. Got a fantastic Magnolia stellata is in full flower outside my window, and my mum gave me that about 30 years ago, so she'd be chuffed to bits to see it.
Oh, brilliant. So not only beautiful, but also very personal, isn't it? We form these connections with plants, don't we, through our lives as gardeners, and it's got a special part of it.
Yeah. And I mean, the reason I've had a career like I've had really is down to my mum and dad. My dad was a teacher. I always say he was a kind of nature table kind of teacher, taught in junior schools, and was passionate about wildlife and nature. And my mum was just a fantastic gardener who could, strike roots on the chair leg kind of thing. She was just a brilliant propagator. So the combination of those two is who I am, really.
So it's in your blood then, really. If your parents were big gardeners, you've kind of grown up with it.
Yeah. And also, I mean, I've always been a campaigner as well. And I think that's in my blood. Growing up in Sheffield, that's where the mass trespass opened up the Peak District, back in the 1930s. And my dad's dad was very much involved involved with the whole rambling world of Sheffield. So that combination of gardening, nature, and revolution is really who I am.
Yeah, that's a good combination. I could buy into that, definitely. It's interesting, isn't it? Nowadays, in a little way, gardeners, we are activists to a certain degree, aren't we? Because there's a lot of stuff going on, environmentally that we need to be concerned with.
Yeah, and I've been doing things, picking at things, I suppose, for 50 years now, really. I mean, the wildlife gardening thing started, really, I suppose, as a reaction against the horticulture that I studied. I went to university to study horticulture at Y College, thinking I was going to learn about nature and wildlife and, all of that. And instead, I spent 3 years being taught how to kill everything, really. I mean, it was all about, it was in the 1960s, it was... wildlife in the garden was either a weed or a pest or a disease. There was no idea that it would be a good thing to encourage. For me, I managed to, I used to present a wildlife strand on a daily TV program called Pebble Mill at 1, which a few people might vaguely remember. The gardening presenter was Peter Seabrook. And he was very orthodox. He'd taken over from Percy Thrower on Gardener's World. And, in those days, Gardener's World, he would appear in his collar and tie. And I managed to get onto Gardener's World in 1979. We did a couple of garden makeovers. This is long, long before Alan Titchmarsh and Charlie Dimmock and all of that. One garden on a housing estate in Peterborough, which I called a rich habitat garden. And I remember Peter saying, well, what's the idea here? And he was there in his shirt and tie. I had long hair and a beard and was clearly from the other universe. And I said to Peter, well, I want it to be a garden that really attracts wildlife. And he just said, and you really think Britain's gardeners are going to be interested in that? So that was 79. And then in 1985, I made the very first wildlife garden at Chelsea Flower Show. And that was a similar kind of reaction, really. I got in kind of under false pretenses because I designed a bonsai display at Chelsea about 10 years earlier, which meant I was on an approved list. And they didn't kind of read the small print, I don't think, of what I was going to do. And I remember the very first day at Chelsea going around the other garden designers and digging up daisies from their lawns to plant in my lawn. And the idea that anybody at Chelsea in 1985 would want daisies in their lawn. And the RHS was so completely wrong-footed by the idea that on my Chelsea medal, it says to J.C. Baines for his wildfire garden. They just could not get their heads around the idea that you could have the word wildlife and the word garden in the same sentence. So we've come a very, very long way since then.
Yeah, they would have shot them.
No, I mean, every garden at Chelsea is full of cowslips and primroses and foxgloves.
We have. It's incredible because now they can't get enough of it, can they, really? It's all wildlife. And I know it, when I apprenticed, I remembered it. Everything had to be edged. Everything had to be weeded. Everything, in a rose garden, there was only a roses allowed in it. And we've become much more freer with our garden, haven't we? Much more, almost liberated, I feel.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really proud to have been a part of that. Really, I made a TV program in '85 called Blue Tits and Bumblebees, which was about the making of a wildlife garden in my own garden. Starting with a patch of lawn, boring lawn, and finishing up with a pond and a meadow full of cowslips and flower borders full of nectar plants and things.
Right. So in a way, you trailblazed this then to a certain degree, because obviously, I mean, you mentioned Peter Seabrook. I've had a few heated discussions with him about the use of peat and stuff over the years. Yeah, and so I know that you do get that clashing of ideologies, and it's quite interesting. But you must be quite proud now when you see the fact that that really the trade has embraced it. Certainly, the up and coming people in the trade seem to be embracing it.
Yeah, it has been a revolution, really, and it's made a difference, actually. I mean, there are certainly species of birds in particular that I remember were virtually unseen. Goldfinches, for instance, real rarities back in '85. Now, people are constantly telling me they get 30 or 40 goldfinches on their bird feeders. So gardens have made a big positive difference once people started to see them as a place where they could enjoy and encourage wildlife rather than a place that they needed to kind of keep the wildlife out. And it has got easier and easier, I think, because commerce has provided the resources, bird feeders and all the rest of it. And I think if it wasn't for garden ponds, dragonflies and damselflies and newts and frogs would really be having an even tougher time, because in the wider countryside, they really have struggled. But Anne reckoned that there were 10,000 garden ponds in Sheffield alone.
I was going to say, originally that you had a lot of water in farmland, didn't you? Because they used to use it to so that the animals could drink. But all of those water sources have kind of gone. And do you think the urban gardens taken over from?
Yeah, I mean, I think it just got easier and easier to wipe out the wet bits, really, as the machines got bigger and, land drains got easier to install, and it was all mechanized. All of those rough bits of the countryside, the wet field corners, the boggy bits, just have largely disappeared. And the hedgerows, as we all know, disappeared in the 90s. And if you then compare that kind of degraded, wider farming landscape with a mature residential housing area. I live in pretty close to the centre of Wolverhampton. It's a 10-minute walk to Marks and Spencer, so I'm right in the middle of the town. But I'm surrounded by an urban forest, really, of street trees. There's a park around the back. All of my neighbours have different kinds of gardens. So my front garden is I suppose 40% pond, and the rest of it is flower borders and woodland wildflowers. And so I don't have a lawn. But my next door neighbour has a lawn. And so, the song thrush is gathering mud at the edge of my pond, and then it's nipping over the hedge and gathering worms from his lawn. And if you think about the kind of complexity of that mosaic of different spaces and habitats, all in that urban forest setting, and compare that with the average stretch of improved agricultural farmland, there's no comparison. The bird song here is fantastic in the morning. It really is, because they're woodland birds, really.
Well, I'm up on the top floor of a block in North London, and I have a balcony. And it's funny you mentioned goldfinch, because I'm in a tree line there's a tree line off just the balcony. There was 30 goldfinches there this morning. So I've got long-tailed tits, I've got great, and it is really fun. In a little way, I suppose, I know you can look at the world and think we're all in trouble because of the environment, but gardeners can contribute these little spaces really do add up to something, don't they?
They add up to a great deal, and we're a very urban nation. Of all the people on the earth today, it's something like 1 in 100 live in the British Isles, so we're a pretty crowded bit of the globe. But we're also a great gardening nation, and so in most urban areas, gardens make up a very substantial proportion of the land surface. I always think of my garden as a kind of glade in the urban forest that's better than the average glade in the average forest, because a big mammal wanders out in the morning and hangs food up for you. I mean, how good can it be if you're a blue tit or a great tit?
Yeah, exactly. Well, they eat better than me, my birds. So it's more than just a kind of nice to have, really. It's made a big difference. And goldfinches are a very positive story, but actually it's not all good news. I remember, again, when I was those very early gardens, I would always have spotted flycatcher. There's a beautiful bird that migrates from Africa, and I in the first edition of the book, I wrote something to the effect that if you put up a small shelf in a climber on the fence or the wall, and you leave it quite late, because spotted flycatchers migrate and arrive quite late, you'll be very unlucky not to get a spotted flycatcher. That's 40 years ago. I haven't seen one for 10 years. Disappeared.
Yeah. So it's not, and it's essentially because we've seen a spectacular decline in the number of insects. I remember as a kid, one of my jobs, if we ever were treated to a drive in my granddad's car, my job was to keep getting out and scraping the insects off the headlamp. When did you last have to do that? I mean, and so if you lose the insects, well, you lose pretty well everything in the end, because even the seed-eating birds have to have invertebrates, have to have animal food to feed their young when they first hatch. So breeding success has declined, and that's it's very difficult to know whether there's one major thing that's made the difference.
Yeah, it could be a possibility, a combination of things, couldn't it? I suppose that's and also some creatures like the great tit you mentioned are incredibly adaptable to urban life, haven't they? They take to it much easier. I'm interested. Obviously, you've got this book, How to Make a Wildlife Garden. It's been re-released, updated and re-released. Brilliant news and a brilliant book. So, can you give me some tips on how people can welcome wildlife into their gardens?
I think the main thing I would say is look at your whole neighborhood and see how your garden fits in. Just that's the best way to kind of understand what you're trying to do. And what you're trying to do is to create a kind of service station in that network. That's why ponds and water are so important, because if there are any hedgehogs in your neighborhood, if there are any foxes in your neighborhood, they will come to your garden if you've got water. So even a puddle in a hot, dry summer will make a difference to survival. So I think water would be the plants that you choose. It's not rocket science, really. If you visit other gardens or you visit garden centres and look at what the bees and the butterflies are actually on, then those are the plants that they're choosing, and you need to choose the same ones. And it's plants that are single, so they're rather than double flowers, so they're producing lots of pollen and nectar, and to try and get as long a flowering season as possible. So the grape hyacinths are just coming out in the garden now, the wallflowers. But I've already had a fantastic display outside the front door of a winter honeysuckle, Lanissa fragrantissima, which fills the garden with perfume, but also is buzzing with bees whenever there was a warm, sunny day in January. And then running right the way through to the autumn and Michaelmas daisies right through to October, November. And then, the honeysuckle comes in again. So trying to get a year-round supply of food, and not just nectar and pollen, also obviously seeds and berries in the autumn make a big difference. The third thing I think is to think about shelter. And so hedges and fences covered in climbers provide lots of cover for birds to nest in and for bats to roost in and that kind of thing. But also you can boost the nesting sites for whole nesting birds, things like blue tits and great tits, by putting up nesting boxes. So you can begin to offer what a woodland glade would have in a real wood, but you can't afford to have big dead trees and dead branches in your garden, but you can actually provide the nesting size. And then I suppose finally, there's the whole business of bird feeding. And that's much more tricky now, I think, because
I was going to say, because now they say maybe should we be feeding in the spring and the summer when there's bountiful food for them, or do you just feed them for the winter?
I think it's. I mean, I've always believed that actually, if the habitat and the neighbourhood is rich enough, then for most of the year, birds are going to be fine. But if you want to see them, having bird feeders outside your window brings them to you, and that's part of the purpose of the exercise. But there is this whole worry now about disease and bird flu, and also if you keep on feeding in the same place, then rats will find the debris underneath the bird feeder. And so I think feeding you should think about as a way of getting the birds where you can see them. And it's particularly good, I think, in the winter when actually natural food can be in very short supply. And the other thing that I would say to people is don't just judge your garden by daylight. Actually, go out with a torch at night and you'll find that actually there's an awful lot of wildlife out there that you perhaps never noticed. To go out there at night with a powerful torch and look down into the water, you suddenly realize there's a whole other world out there that you never normally notice. So one of the things that I think has been fantastic about the whole wildlife gardening revolution, if I can call it that, is that more and more gardeners are now beginning to use their garden as a place to really look in detail. And there's a whole citizen science movement gathering data, gathering information. So the biggest of those things is the Big Garden Bird Watch, which takes place every year. Bee Watch, Butterfly Watch, Hog Watch, Frog Watch. And all of that is ordinary gardeners with an ordinary garden looking at it and thinking, well, actually, the information I'm absorbing could be more use if we added it to everybody else's knowledge. And so we're really learning through gardeners a great deal more about what's happening to the wildlife. And that's true of the kind of declining birds and the increasing birds, but it's also true of things like the way that climate change is bringing new pests into the gardens. It's gardeners who will be noticing the harlequin ladybirds that have been spreading from the southeast all the way up the country, and the green parakeets that everybody's familiar with in south of England are now, well, as far as Scotland. I mean, that's taken them 20 years, I guess.
There's plenty of them here in London. This thing, yeah.
They came through, they arrived in Wolverhampton about 5 years ago, I remember. It's now the soundtrack, isn't it, of Chelsea. I always think when I go to Chelsea in the spring, it's the soundtrack of Chelsea now. It's green parakeets. Yeah.
Yes, it is. Yeah. My local park, you just get big flocks of them, and they're a sign of probably climate, but also just globalization, isn't it? The fact we move around the planet so much now.
And the bird feeding. I mean, I think bird feeding has made a significant difference to their success too. So, it's just interesting. It's just interesting to have all of that to think about on your doorstep.
And then the fact that also gardeners are front line, aren't we? We're there. We're custodians in many ways, and so I always feel we're very underrated, undervalued set of people, and horticulture generally. So it's nice to know that we do play an important role. So tell me about your relationship with Garden Organic, because you were quite involved heavily, weren't you, before?
Yeah, well, when they moved to Rugby and set up Wrighton Gardens, that's an hour from where I live. And I got to know them quite well. And one of the things that I did was to create a wildlife garden at Wrighton, right in the first year, and then worked with them on a wildflower meadow there. So, right from the very beginning of their arrival in Wrighton, I was involved. I was also really interested in the kind of research side of what they were doing. This is the first time that gardeners have got involved en masse with things like composting experiments and demonstrations. So the early days of Wrighton were really revolutionary in that they were absolutely about education. They were all about demonstrating. And I just remember being blown away by the quality of what they were demonstrating, that you could grow entirely organically at a time when essentially, every gardener assumed that you had to spray everything, that you had to use artificial fertilizers. Wrighton was the place that was proving that not to be the case.
In a way, it's pioneering, because at the time you would have been sort of organic gardening, wildlife gardening would have been written off as a sort of hippie thing, or sort of like an outsider sort of thing. So really, Garden Organic and yourself and Lawrence, etc., you kind of made it into a science, didn't you? You made organic gardening, wildlife gardening into something that was real and you couldn't, that was knowledgeable, basically.
Yeah, and also, we were publicists, I suppose. So the Muck and Magic series on TV was going at the same time as I was doing I did lots of television in the 80s, particularly lots of children's television. I had a series called The Wild Side of Town, which was showing people just how much wildlife there was living in the towns and cities. And even now, it's a bit of a revelation. You had to be pretty determined in those days to actually be heard, really. And Garden Organic or Henry Doubleday Research Association and I were absolutely kind of arguing the case that there was a different and better way of doing things. And now, they're both absolutely mainstream.
Well, it's just what I'm saying. You were visionaries, weren't you? Because now it's everywhere, almost in a way. What Lawrence was saying, what you yourself were saying, Henry Doubleday, that was important, wasn't it, almost for the future? Because everybody now, all the big guns, the RHS, the English Heritage, the National Trust, are all now taking these ideas on, aren't they? So
the reason that I wanted to do a new and expanded edition of the book, which first came out nearly 40 years ago, was because my work's changed. I'm now really involved on a much wider landscape, but it's still basically about habitat creation, feed. So there's a real kind of growing up, if you like, of the idea that we can't just stand back and watch everything disappear. We have to intervene. And the 40 years of gardening in that kind of way has, I think, given people the confidence to say, well, yeah, we could begin to bring back the woodlands and bring back the salt marsh. As a part of this need to shift our thinking, nature is beginning to be seen as a tool that we can use to reverse climate change and to actually bring back the wildlife while we're actually beginning to reduce the impact of climate change and global warming. So it's a very, very exciting time, really.
I was just saying, it's absolutely fascinating. It really is. And that just that understanding that you have about how everything weaves together, it's nothing's independent, is it? It all kind of connects. It's all a web, if you like.
As a horticulturalist, I think one of the great lessons I learned as a student was really to understand about hybrid vigor, and that if you bring two organisms together and combine them, then the whole becomes greater than the sum of its parts. And that's very much what my work really is, bringing all these. I always say I'm somebody who creates partnerships between strange bedfellows, so unholy alliances, really. I love nothing better than getting the nature conservation people and the water industry and the energy industry working together, because when they all kind of leave their baggage at the door and start to play to their strengths, you can begin to see how you can join it all together and begin to recover. My lifetime's been a lifetime spent watching things disappear.
So you sound quite optimistic about it all, Chris. I love that personally. You sound quite upbeat about it. Is that important, do you think?
I am an optimist. I'm an enthusiast and an optimist. I'm also a realist. I've watched so much stuff disappear. I was talking to a friend yesterday, and we were both saying that when we were growing up, if I walked out of the edge of Sheffield into the fields, 30 or 40 lapwings would fly up. Now, if I see a lapwing, I screech to a halt and get out and try and photograph it. So
yeah.
It's been a disaster, really. The last 60 or 70 years in terms of wildlife really has. The one saving grace, I think, in UK has been gardens. Gardens have actually got better, and urban areas, ironically, have got better for wildlife, whilst the wider countryside has got worse and worse and worse. But this is the moment to change that.
Yes, it's right. So it's recoverable, is what you're saying. If we do the right things, we can pull this back. Yeah.
Yeah, and there are some exciting examples. We now have otters, for instance, in every county. 30 years ago, they were pretty well extinct, apart from West Wales and the north of Scotland. But because ironically, everybody's talking about the pollution in rivers, but the rivers are so much cleaner and healthier than they were 30 or 40 years ago. And I'm president of something called the Thames Estuary Partnership. And the story of the Thames Estuary is fantastic, really. 70 years ago, it was dead, biologically dead. There are now something like 140 different species of fish in there. There's even a large population of harbour porpoises that lives in the Thames beside the House of Commons. Who knew? So there is a fantastically positive strand here. It's just that we need to do very, very much more, and we need to do it with a bit more urgency, and we need to join up all the resources we can muster to actually make it happen. Well, it would be nice if it started to happen in my lifetime, but certainly the next 70 years ought to be the 70 years of reversal and recovery, really.
Yeah, well, I'm sure, it's great how you're doing all this stuff. I find it personally very inspirational, and I hope other people do. I hope they get the book, because obviously all these ideas are in there. If someone wanted to come and chat to you more, are you out and about? If you wanted to come and, just get a copy of your book, get you to sign it, where are you going to be?
But I'm actually going to the spring show in Malvern, the RHS Spring Show in Malvern. On the Saturday, I'm going to be giving a talk in Malvern on the Saturday. So hopefully I shall see a few people there.
I will be at Malvern that day. I'm doing stuff with the kids' gardeners, so I'll certainly come along and get you to sign a copy of a book from me. It's been wonderful to talk to you, Chris. I really enjoyed. I actually could have spoken to you all night, to be fair. Maybe we'll get. I'd like to be. I look forward to chatting again with you. That's for sure. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
That's great. It's a pleasure, and it's so nice to be doing something with Garden Organic.
Yeah, thanks very much. Brilliant.
So we've opened up the post bag once again. Some great questions this month, as ever. I'm here with Anton and Chris. Hi, Anton.
Hi, Fiona.
Hi, Chris.
Hi, Fiona. Hi, Anton.
Right, we're going straight in with perennial veg to start with. So, dear Garden Organic, in your latest Members Magazine, you ran an article suggesting we grow more perennial vegetables. However, I was wondering then how that fits with the 4-year rotation of different types of veg that we do to reduce pest buildup. How does this work if the same veg are in the same bed perennially? I have 4 veg beds to grow in and I haven't got room for permanent crops as well. So that's Heather asking that question.
There's a lot of reasons why you'd want to grow perennial veg, and they have become more popular recently. One reason is time saving, because you're only having to plant them out once and then they're producing for a number of years. And also because they use quite a lot less resources. They've got a good root system down there, so you're not having to water them so much. So that's really important. And also all the sort of resources associated with raising plants as well. You're not having to use sort of seed trays and seed compost every year. So from a resource point of view, they really make a lot of sense. They also, a lot of them are available during the hungry gap as well. So they help to sort of fill in that gap. So they've got a good role.
Okay, so Heather asked about rotation specifically.
So with rotations, obviously perennial veg are going to stay in a lot longer, so they don't really fit into a normal 4-year rotation. My experience with perennial veg is that they tend to stay in the ground for about sort of 3 or 4 years, and then the quality tends to decrease, particularly with something like perennial kale. You end up with a lot of sort of branch woody stems. And so at that stage, you probably want to take cuttings, divide them, and then move them on. So in effect, you do end up rotating them, but in very slow motion. You basically end up moving them every sort of 4 years. I like to call it a zombie rotation, but generally you need to keep them in a separate area, because otherwise it ends up getting quite sort of muddled up with all the rest of your other crops.
Okay, so Chris, let's dive in a bit more here. Perennial veg, it's sort of a bit of a term that has come along, but actually there's perennial crops in most kitchen gardens. Do you want to demystify that a little bit more for us?
Yeah, of course. I mean, you've probably already got perennial veg on your site anyway. I mean, think of rhubarb. I had a delicious rhubarb crumble on Sunday, by the way, from my allotment. So they're definitely worth it. But I say, quite a lot of, like you mentioned, kale, perpetual spinach, sorrel, horseradish. There's quite a lot of crops we grow you can put on the allotment. So I have one bed put aside for that. I think my tip would be really is to make sure you just prepare the area well. My allotment can be very weedy because it wasn't, as you well know, it wasn't looked after for so long. So my dilemma would be if I put in perennial veg, because they're static for at least 3 or 4 years, all that weed's going to come through and cause me problems. So I think the good organic trick of making sure you leave it a season, put down a cover, some cardboard, some compost over the top, just let it sit to shade out all the perennial weeds before you plant your perennial veg bed in there, I think. So a little bit of preparation, or you can put them in a raised bed and get around it that way as well. So that's what I did. I do crop them quite regularly. I totally agree with Anton about how it's slow motion movement, because I would treat them like I treat herbaceous perennials, basically, like in an herbaceous border. I will lift them every 3 and 4 years. I'll divide them and I'll put them back again. And that what means it just maintains plant vigor. They get a bit old and woody and they tend to hollow out in the centre if you don't do that. So if you lift and divide, put them back, you'll get young, vigorous growth again, and that will be straight into the kitchen.
So yes, rotation in slow motion. I love it. Zombie rotation, as Anton
That's brilliant.
said.
It's a brilliant expression. I'm going to remember that.
Okay, fantastic. Right. Moving on to scarrid fly. I have little black scarrid flies on my compost, which I used to ignore. But then a couple of years ago, I had a problem with wilting aubergines in my greenhouse. So I've been trying to control them. I find they're in the compost I buy when I get home. How can I keep them under control? And that's from Bill. Gosh, yes. Well, Anton, first of all, what is scarrid fly?
So scarrid flies are tiny little black flies. You distinguish them from fruit flies because scarrid flies tend to jerk around and dance on the top of your compost, whereas fruit flies tend to drift around. So a scarrid fly tends to have a much more sort of jerky motion. And the flies themselves aren't a problem, but it's actually their grubs which are a real problem because they lay their eggs into the compost and then you'll see that there are tiny little maggots, only a sort of couple of millimeters long, but they eat the roots of your plants. Generally, that's not such a problem with larger plants, but with seedlings, that can really cause a problem. It can even kill off the seedlings. So I particularly find it's a problem in things like with a large fleshy seed. They seem to really go for that. So things particularly like, actually pumpkin seeds can be quite bad because they can even eat at the shoot before it comes out. So sometimes you find that when something hasn't germinated, you take out the seed and you find a massive little maggots in there, and that's the reason it hasn't germinated. Also, things like French beans as well can be a problem. And for some reason, they really make a beeline for coriander as well. They seem to love the smell of it, unlike a lot of people. Yeah, you just have to watch those sort of plants. So it's mainly a problem in seedlings. And what you'll notice is that the seedlings start to wilt even when you're watering them well. And because the scarrid fly likes damp conditions, your instinct when you see something wilting is to water it. But actually you're making the problem worse there. So it's a tricky one if you get it in your seedlings.
Gosh, it's quite a complex pest, this one, isn't it? How would you deal with it, Anton, organically?
So there are a number of ways you can deal with them. Prevention is one of the best ways. And as they often fly into your compost and lay the eggs into the compost, just be really vigilant with your bags of compost. Make sure that you fold the tops down if you've got an open bag of compost. So that's quite important. Secondly, try and avoid overwatering. I find they're really an inside pest problem. They're not a problem outside. So I've actually found if you can put the seed trays outside during the day, then that really does decrease the problem massively. If it's still a problem, then there are some biological treatments as well. There's either a nematode that you can water in and water your seed trays with. But I've found that there is a mite, which I found that more effective, and you get it in like a little sort of pepper shaker and you shake it onto your compost and you can actually see the little mites crawling out, a little army of mites that are going to go and attack those scarrid fly larvae. So those are sort of possibilities you can use. They tend to be on the pricey side, so you'd probably use them if you've got a sort of larger area to treat.
Okay, well, you've described them really well. I now know exactly what you're talking about because of that jerky flight motion that they do. Chris, you must have some of these in the houseplants.
Yeah, I certainly do. I saw one a little while ago, actually. I mean, I've got over 100 houseplants in the flat. So I've just learned to live with them, really, to be honest with you, Fiona. They're around. I think the point Anton makes is quite important. I think they are related to how damp and wet the compost is. So a good free draining, decent compost is quite important. I tend to also, with my houseplants, mix the compost with some some bark or some good roughage, and that helps it drain quicker. I also tend to keep my houseplants fairly dry. I don't overwater them. My big concern is obviously they might get into all the seedlings I have at the house as well this time of year. Putting them outside, I think I'm hardening off my seedlings at the moment, so they're going out into the air, then they're coming back in the evening. I'm sure that is one of the reasons why I don't see any scarrid fly damage on them, but it's all a case of observation, making sure I look at those seedlings make sure that the scarab I've got on the houseplants don't transfer to the seedlings. That's the main thing. I love the idea of a pepper shaker full of mites. If I spot any, then I shall be on that straight away.
Absolutely, yes, that's great. I love the pepper shaker as well. Fantastic. Okay, so final question from Sue. I've been trying to buy organic topsoil, free of pesticides. Garden centres look at me like I'm crazy for wanting such a thing. Does it exist? Anton?
So in short answer, no, there isn't actually an organic standard for topsoil. And this might sound a bit counterintuitive at first, but actually it's a technical reason. Organic standards relate to things which are grown directly in the soil. So there's no accounting for moving soil around. So that's the reason why we don't have an organic standard for topsoil. However, there is actually a quality assurance standard. It's got the rather charming name of BS3882. So you want to look out for that when you're buying topsoil. You probably will find it on most reputable suppliers. We tend to get most of our sort of topsoils and compost from Melcourt. They specify that they are pesticide free. So perhaps look at the small print as well when you are buying topsoil, because I think some suppliers have gone in for a little bit more sort of rigorous testing. So just have a little look around and shop around. Some topsoil will say that it also has added compost, and this is particularly the ones which say topsoil for veg growing. And that compost also has a quality assurance standard called PAS 100. So you want to look out for that. It's another sort of standard to say that it reaches certain sort of quality levels of the compost. So just have a look out for that as well when you're buying topsoil.
Thanks, Anton. A great comprehensive answer. And in fact, a great discussion. Well, that's it for the postbag. Lots of good questions this time. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.
Cheers, Fiona. Cheers, Anton.
See you all next time.
Well, that's it for the Organic Gardening podcast this month, but if you've any questions for us, do drop us a line at advice@gardenorganic.org.uk. A special thank you to Chris Baines for sharing his wisdom and experience with us. His book has been republished as the RHS Companion to Wildlife Gardening. Before we go, there's just enough time for me to tell you about a few things we've got coming up now the gardening season is in full swing. I'm delighted to say we'll have a stand at the Scone Palace Garden Fair just north of Perth on the 2nd and 3rd of June. And we're doing a full show garden at Gardeners World Live at the NEC in Birmingham on the 15th to the 18th of June. The theme is biodiversity in your backyard. You can book our courses and events via our website gardenorganic.org.uk. There's loads going on, including our AGM on the 18th of May if you're a member of Garden Organic. And don't forget to have a look at our inspirational social media channels. We're at Garden Organic on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. We want to do all we can to help you grow the organic way. Our thanks to Kevin MacLeod for the music. That's it, until next time.